You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome, Housers, to another episode of On the Way Home. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite, on this very snowy day that we recorded this. Today we're doing an election piece, and as you hear this, it is election day in Ontario. We have a provincial election that is coming up fast, and so we pulled three brilliant young experts on to talk about that election and the issues around housing and homelessness, etc. So our sector can kind of take that in and see if you agree, disagree, but it just gives you some insight as to the sector and what's happening for this provincial election in regards to affordability, housing, and homelessness. Before we get to that, I should say that my day job is the CEO of Blue Door, where I'm so fortunate to work with 150 people, much brighter than myself, doing the heavy lifting to help our most vulnerable across York, Peel, and Durham region in the areas of housing, health, and meaningful and well-paid employment. Check us out at bluedoor.ca. And so I mentioned I have three. I didn't realize till they were on. I thought, wow, these are three people under the age of 40, well under the age of 40. We have Kyle Fox, who's the former director of policy of the Federal Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, and he talks about the last 10 years. I mean, the resume and his experiences that he's had in government are incredible. We also have Jacob Gorenkoff, who's a regular on the show, who is the founder and CEO of Homer Public Affairs, a government relations firm that works with a lot of nonprofits around positioning them with government on the different issues that matter. And of course, Maggie Rodrigues, who's been on before from CAEH, who is the government relations lead there. And Maggie talks about her advocacy work and her background, her work in this. So we walked through talking about the different party platforms, what they're excited about, what the parties might need to focus on. We talk about what the current government has gotten right, because they've done some things really well over the past 7 years, and maybe where they could strengthen moving forward. We talk about the tariffs, how they, although they're going to affect us all, how can they'll affect our most vulnerable the most, and how can government, whoever's in power, strengthen our response to that, so our most vulnerable feel the impact less through housing and say income supports. And we talk about their hopes next Friday morning when we know who is going to form government in Ontario. It's a fascinating conversation with three brilliant young people who have given this a lot of thought. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's go to that conversation now. Maggie, Kyle, and Jacob, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
See, that's the trouble with podcast listeners, is that when I say something like that, people, and I don't direct it, people don't know. So they all said, good to be here, I think. That's what I heard anyways. We're going to change up our first question a little bit. We usually ask, what does home mean to you? But since we've got a couple veterans on, and Kyle's been at this work for a long, long time, we're going to switch it up a little bit. I'm going to ask each of you, what are your first memories of home? Kyle, we're going to start with you as the newest addition to the pod panel. We'll go to Maggie and end with Jacob.
Yeah, no, for sure. So for me, I actually grew up, my parents and I grew up in a house with my grandparents, a multi-generational household. And when I would come home from school, some of the most earliest memories were eating classic Filipino meals like spam and longanisa and chicken adobo, and using that time to relax and recharge from the day at school. As growing up, I also watched a lot of television, Family Channel, Cartoon Network growing up. And so between that and playing with my grandfather's train sets, it was really a time where I used to relax, recharge, feel comfort from the days of the stressful days of elementary school.
That's great, Kyle. For me, when I was born, my parents rented a house in the beaches in Toronto and decided when I was a baby that they didn't want to live in a basement apartment anymore. And so they decided to buy a house in the suburbs, which is why we moved out of Toronto. And so those are my earliest memories, is that street that I grew up in the suburbs of Toronto. I honestly tell people it was the perfect place to grow up. Like, everyone on our street had kids about my age. We would play together after school. It was a really safe place for us to be. And so home always felt like a really comfortable, safe, and fun place growing up on that street.
Oh, that's awesome, Maggie. I have similar memories of where I grew up in North York near Bathurst and Finch. But I always like to say that I've always been driven by this desire to help people, and that really started at home. Unfortunately, though, my first memory was a little bit of a misguided attempt at helping, because what I tried to do was cover the staircase to our basement in flour, because I thought that would help clean the staircase for my parents, so it would make their lives easier. It did not. It just stained the carpet white with flour. But it just goes to show, though, that I think some of the best memories that we have at home are where you feel safe to try to help or try to do things, whether you're hitting the mark or not, being mischievous or not, right?
So thank you all for those memories. Very cool. I want to hear about your journeys into this work. You're all involved in government relations. And again, we're going to start with Kyle and go to Jacob and then end with Maggie.
For sure. So about 10 years ago, I actually started my career at Toronto City Hall. So for about 2 years, I worked for my local city councilor in Scarborough-Guildwood. And a lot of that was constituency work. So you get, everything under the sun, from somebody that wants a tree planted in their front lawn, or, the long TCHC wait list where someone is trying to get affordable housing. So that's sort of where my career, especially as it relates to housing, it started. Over the next couple of years, I went to the political side, and I started to work as a field organizer for the Liberal Party of Canada. So training campaign teams before an election for voter persuasion, voter outreach, to get out the vote efforts. And I was actually able to manage several campaigns, actually, both federally and provincially over that time span too. 2019, I went to Ottawa to work for several federal ministers. So where you folks know me from, of course, I worked as the policy advisor, senior policy advisor, and then director of policy for the last 3 federal housing and ministers of housing and infrastructure. So doing things like policy design, the housing plan that we created as well, the housing accelerator fund, the rapid housing initiative, and also a lot of that is actually issues management. So when projects have cost overruns, and that's probably the more challenging part of the job. But that's been my path so far.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's awesome, and it was really great getting to work with you when you were at. Can I call it HIC, Kyle? Are we allowed?
I would prefer not, but yes, that's the technical term.
Yeah, technically, yeah. Well, I kind of fell into doing a lot of this work. Out of grad school, I got a job doing government relations with the Canadian Real Estate Association, which is predominantly focused on home ownership. And for different reasons, I wanted to do something different where I could actually have more of an impact and help people that I felt could benefit from my experience and all sorts of other things more. And so I ended up getting a job as a director at the Canadian Housing Renewal Association, where I ended up leading the policy and advocacy work there. And that's actually how I met the 3 of you, which makes me incredibly thankful for being there in a personal way as well. From there, I realized that there were just so many amazing organizations like Blue Door, like the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, that needed public policy and government relations support. And so in January 2024, I launched my government relations firm, Homeward Public Affairs, and been at it for, I guess, 13 months now, and it's going pretty well.
Yeah, I'd say it's going pretty well for you, Jacob. My path, I think, was a little bit different into this work. I had gotten involved in advocacy, really grassroots advocacy type work, through the intersection with disability and education. So throughout my undergrad here in Ottawa, I'd been involved with the community of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities through a various number of organizations. And really saw one of the barriers was people with disabilities transitioning out of high school, and the ways they were integrating into our community. And so I actually got support through a fellowship program called the Pathy Foundation Fellowship. And they provide new grads with funding and support for a year to lead a project that drives social change in their community. And I worked with high school students with disabilities to support their transition out of high school. And I think for me, that really opened my eyes to a lot of the advocacy that was necessary for that to happen. Like I was doing a lot of work in the school and with the community organizations, but really there was a lot of advocacy that had to happen behind the scenes for them to be able to be a part of our community. And so I became really interested in like the direct advocacy, government relations type of work because of that. And then found myself from there really entering like the professional government relations space at Universities Canada. And I worked there for 4 years doing their government relations work around a number of education related issues. In my last year there, I really focused in the housing space. And so looking at the student housing question that was really top of mind over the past couple of years. And I thought, okay, I really want to focus in on this housing and government relations intersection. And that's how I got towards the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. So we're not really a linear path to get here, but still really interested in that grassroots advocacy, disability education, housing kind of intersection.
And can I just say for all three of you, I think it's incredible to see three brilliant young people that so invested in government relations and change and moving things forward. It gives me a lot of hope for the future. I'm kind of on the tail end of things, but I get energized by young people who, I mean, let's face it, the work that you do has a high burnout rate. It's tough work. And it's kind of, I think it just has to be kind of in your blood, right? I mean, because it is a grind. You're pushing hard for a lot of things. Things are rapidly changing. And speaking of that change, we find ourselves today, what we want to talk about, we're in the midst of a quick Ontario election. Now, this election is called about a year and a half before the actual election had to be called. I think it was June 2026. So Premier Doug Ford has called this election. This will air on February 27th. So on the election, we've got about a week or so, a week and a day before that happens. Right now, as it stands, it looks like the Conservatives have a fairly comfortable lead. It shrank a little bit after, we've had a couple of debates. But there's been a lot of talk, and obviously this is a podcast around housing and homelessness. So we're going to focus on that today, among many of the issues, or affordability we can talk about too. But there's been a lot of talk about housing and homelessness on the campaign trail, what has been done, what hasn't been done, what needs to be done. I'm hoping you could shed some light on what each party is proposing moving forward, and what your thoughts are on their platforms. We're going to start with Kyle, then go to Maggie, and end with Jake.
Yeah, when it comes to, I would say maybe Doug Ford and the Conservatives, I think what we're seeing on the campaign trail isn't too far off what they've been saying over the last couple of years. They're talking about reducing red tape. They have their Red Tape Reduction Act. They're talking about investing into housing enabling infrastructure like water and wastewater. And they're talking about setting targets for municipalities and providing funding for those municipalities that exceed and meet those targets. And as well as, of course, on the homelessness side, they talk about, more so on as it relates to crime. From my perspective, I think a lot of folks have seen this as well, that there could be a lot more ambition with respect to reducing red tape, especially around, let's say, legalizing density, which we didn't see in the Reducing Red Tape Act. And, I think when it comes to homelessness, one of the things that I look at, and one of the maybe criticisms I would have is with respect to having a little bit more of housing first and compassionate approach to addressing homelessness, which we don't necessarily see when you're reducing safe consumption sites, when you're reducing the amount of sort of penalizing people that within the encampments as well. But on the bright side, they have invested a little bit in terms of wraparound supports and housing affordability as well. We know with the Canada Ontario housing benefit and top-ups there. When it comes to the Ontario Liberal Party, I'm a little bit biased, but I do think it is, of the three, probably the most comprehensive of the plans. When it comes to, committing to legalizing 4 units and 4 stories of right, introducing pre-approved designs to streamline approvals, grants and tax incentives for modular and prefab housing, talking about, using public lands to reduce the cost of housing. And they also talk about wraparound supports and affordable housing too. But, something that the Conservatives do that the Ontario Liberal Party isn't doing is setting those targets. And I do think setting targets are important when it comes to either reducing municipal approval timelines or unit targets. And I think I would like to see a little bit more on unsheltered homelessness from the Ontario Liberal Party, something maybe to similar what Manitoba is doing. But, But yeah, and I think the Ontario NDP are very similar to the Ontario Liberal Party, maybe with just a little bit more focus on affordable housing. But there are a lot of things that they aren't doing, which was why I say it's sort of, to me, the second most ambitious of the plans. So, you don't really talk about using reducing development charges. They don't talk about, using public lands as much. So that's sort of, I would say, where I think the three parties are at, where their positives and some of the negatives are at this point.
That was very comprehensive, Kyle. Thank you. Off the top, just a note that I work for a nonpartisan organization that is not taking sides in any of these elections. But obviously, we were running the Homes Not Handcuffs campaign kind of in the months leading up to the election, not necessarily against the party that's in power, but against what some of the decisions that they were putting forward, especially around their the response to encampments. In terms of what the talk has been on housing and homelessness in this election, I'm actually not convinced that I know what this election is about yet. I think we've seen all parties try to take it in a different way, and I don't actually think much of it is sticking. I think off the beginning, we saw the Conservatives talking a lot about Donald Trump and the tariffs, and I think they really wanted to make the election about that. And I think largely there was an opportunity to do that until the tariffs were paused for 30 days and they had to pivot. And I think immediately I saw them starting to talk about things like tolls on the 407. It really changed the type of conversation we were having. And then the Liberals, their opening news conference for the election, I remember the hats. They had everyone was really into hats at the beginning, but they had the hats on about healthcare, and they did their opening news conference in front of a hospital with one of their candidates who's a doctor, and I think they've really tried to make the election about healthcare, and I think in large part Ontarians care about that and want an election around that. And then with the NDP, I think there was some stuff that we've seen around housing and homelessness. We saw, I think they had taken up a lot of the recommendations we had talked about in the Homes Not Handcuffs campaign around more human-centered responses to encampments and not criminalizing people who are without a place to live. But I still don't think that any party has been able to make the election about one specific issue, and they're really trying to narrow it in to what their base cares about.
Yeah, I think between the two of you, you've covered a lot of the key points that are worth noting. Maggie, just picking up on what you were saying about healthcare, according to public opinion polls, you're totally right. Healthcare and affordability are the two top things. Considering that, healthcare and affordability, which also includes housing, are so top of mind, I don't think we've actually been talking about housing and homelessness enough on the campaign trail, regardless of what party you're looking at. Particularly when we consider that the majority of the seats in the legislature will likely go to the PCs and Liberals, with the Liberals probably overtaking the NDP for official opposition status based on the way things are looking right now. I don't know. I think, in terms of the specific policies that have been mentioned, Kyle, you in particular, I really like your overview of everything. But considering the PCs are likely going to win another majority government, I just want to focus on the thoughts that I would add around them. And I think the plan that they put in place is to try to get the most bang for the province's buck with the housing related measures that they've done and what they say they're going to continue to do, with the water and wastewater spending. I also know that there's been talk within the government on creating capital funding programs and trying to provide some funding to incentivize the scale up of modular construction technologies as well, though they haven't talked about that at all on the campaign trail, as far as I know. All that said, I think the Ford government hasn't really done much to directly support the building of new homes. And considering that's so top of mind for voters across the political spectrum, that having housing that people can afford and that meets their needs is so key to our economic resilience, which is what he's been trying to make the election about. You would think that he should be taking a page out of what the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens are trying to put out around housing and integrate that into their policy agenda if they end up winning the election.
Jake, we're going to start with you this time. I do want to say, with the NDP, they talked, one of their pieces on their housing platform is talking about government actually building housing. And that's been brought up to around the city of Toronto, kind of being the actual builder of, or being the lead of that. What are people's thoughts around that? And we're going to do a scramble here so people can just jump in. But I don't know. Is that it? Like, do you think that could be a successful strategy? Has it worked elsewhere? I'm not too sure, but that is a piece of the NDP platform that's a little different than the other parties.
Maybe I can jump in and take a crack at this one. I feel like, so I think it's a good idea. And I think it has, like, as a high level principle, I think when it comes to the success of it, I think it'll depend on implementation. I think what's important is that we don't push out the nonprofit sector and we don't push out the private sector that are developing these important partnerships, because we want ultimately the sector itself to grow. But there are gaps right now. And I think that if you're doing a public builder model, which I think is generally a good idea, you want to do it in a way that you can highlight your strengths as a province. So whether that's land, whether that's, development, like legislating development charge decreases, all these different things that you can do, or, approvals with respect to municipal approvals, or MZOs. Like, I feel like you want to leverage those and use that where the nonprofit and private sector don't have that capacity, or fill the gaps where, let's say, the nonprofit sector may not be able to do pre-development work, for example. But I don't think it should be them taking over the ability and the capacity and space that the nonprofit and private sector do have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kyle, I agree with a lot of what you said. Particularly as it relates to filling the gaps. One of the things that I think is really missing across like multiple policy areas, whether we're looking provincially, federally, locally in a lot of cases, particularly as it relates to housing and like housing construction, is just like a complete lack of coordination. We have people that, or I don't want to say people, but companies or governments that are duplicating work, or aren't doing things that are needed in order to build more homes. That there's such a gigantic housing shortfall in the province and across the country that I think you're right that our governments, including the government of Ontario, should be looking at how they can fill those gaps, and maybe that means that they need to actually get into the business of building homes. Right? I don't have all the answers, but I think it's something that they should be considering at this point.
And the Green Party mentioned that as well, to Kyle's point about, hey, we should be empowering the nonprofit sector to do more. I mean, being from the nonprofit sector and building right now, I can tell you it's not an easy piece. And Jake, you and I have talked about this before, and Kyle, I probably shared with you. I mean, there's a lot of risk for nonprofits to get in, and we don't have all the kind of infrastructure or tools at our disposal that allows us to do this. However, we're kind of uniquely positioned to be able to support in the building of deeply affordable housing. We have land and knowledge, and can service the clients. So I think maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe there's not one, but it was interesting that the NDP was the only party that mentioned that. Now, we've been looking at 7 years right now of conservative majority. They've, and I think you both mentioned, they've got some things right. They've done some good things over the past 7 years. Let's talk about that. And as Maggie mentioned too, this is not a podcast to slam one party or another. It's really to talk about all the different parties, different things going on. At the end of the day, for us in the sector, we have to work with whoever is chosen by the voters to get the job done, and we want to do that. But 7 years. So what have they gotten right? And where have they may have missed the mark or need to strengthen things? Jake, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to you, Kyle.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mike. One of the things that I've liked about the Ford government is the veracity by which they've tried to cut red tape and deal with regulatory barriers and things like that. Of course, there are improvements that could be made there as well. They could be more bold about how they go about doing that. I also like the amount of funding and focus that they've put into trying to boost our skilled workforce, like with programs like the Skills Development Fund, which I know Blue Door has received funds from, I think, every year that the program has been running. I like that they're intending to continue investing there too. We essentially need this holistic sort of approach to creating the homes that we need, which includes making sure that we have the skilled workforce that we need. So I do really like that. What I think is really missing, and I could make a greenbelt joke here. I'm not going to. I'm not even going to really touch it beyond just referencing it. But I think what's been missing is having sufficient stable capital funding so that we can create the supply of affordable homes that Ontario needs. I also get that the reason why it hasn't happened is because the Ford government views capital funding as being expensive. But as I've been saying for years now, our housing issues are an expensive problem that's not going to be solved by cheap solutions. The longer the government of Ontario and other governments across the country put off sufficiently funding creating more housing units in the province and everywhere in the country, the more expensive and the more dire the problem is going to end up being.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I tend to agree with you, Jacob. And I think the way I see it is they've done a really good job at sending the right signals. And I think as Jacob mentioned, the reducing red tape components, whether that's the parts of their act that limit third-party appeals or remove mandatory pre-consultations, these are things that lengthen the home building process at the end of the day. And as we all know, the longer the home building process is, the more expensive it is, and it also the longer it takes for people to get into those homes at the end of the day. So I think that they've done a good job at signaling reducing the red tape, as Jacob mentioned, as I mentioned before. I think there's a lot more that they could be doing with respect to red tape. I do like the idea of that they've done with respect to setting targets. I actually think that's a really important thing to do. Whether or not you meet those targets or not, I think setting a target in the 1.5 million target is the one that they've set. I think that's important for us to at least have a goal to be able to move towards. I think that where, as sort of Jacob has alluded to, what's missing is around that capital funding, around directly investing into these projects. And I think significantly in the affordable housing space, I feel like, the government of Ontario is very focused on reducing red tape. But there's a significant lack of, I think, focus on that affordable housing piece. I think, a lot of you saw earlier last year where, the federal government, when I was there, and the Ford government at the time sort of went back and forth on this Canada housing deal with respect to the amount of affordable housing units that they were going to build and the lack of ambition that we saw there. And I think what I would hope to see from, if it is a conservative government that comes in, there's a little bit more ambition there. And I think when we talk about providing not just, reductions to timelines, but grants to these types of housing projects, which especially in terms of affordable housing projects is very much needed. But yeah, so I think that's what I'd like to see. And I'd like to see a lot more legalization of density. So 4 units of right, 4 stories as of right, and probably something around development charters, I think is where I think would be a lot more helpful too, and in terms of reducing the costs of building homes.
And Maggie, we were just talking about, I loved your point earlier that this is not meant for us to say this party's bad, this party's good, that's anything like that. This is talking about educating people around election, the challenges and the pieces that are in here. We wanted to talk about over the past 7 years where people have hit the mark and they missed. And we're talking about the Conservative government in 7 years. What have they gotten right? And where would we hope for kind of more strength if they're to continue forward? So with that in mind, what we've talked about some of the platforms, what's happening. What are some of the keys for each party moving forward if they're to gain some ground? Right? I think the last poll I saw had the PCs at about 41%, Liberals around 30%, NDP around 23, 24, and then I think the Greens were around 5 or 6. But we still got a week left. With a week left, and knowing that this is airing on election day, what are some strategies they could take on to gain ground? Thoughts? This time we'll start with you, Kyle, go to Jacob, and then end with Maggie.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, well, as you mentioned, it looks like the Conservatives are probably tracking for a majority, if not a super majority. And so I think what we've seen in the election is that Doug Ford is really his own biggest enemy sometimes, whether it's the hot mic that we saw earlier on with respect to Trump, or at the time of this recording. The debate, I think it was yesterday or the day before, and where he was, sort of berated on things like healthcare and affordability and the Greenbelt scandal as well. So I think for Doug Ford, he needs to have a consistent message on the topics that he's winning and the topics that people care about and will believe. And I think for him, that's the Canada-U.S. relations, and I think it's the economy. So he did obviously the trip to DC, and he's been really focusing on sort of being team Captain Canada, very much so. And so I think if he's going to have success, it's going to be hammering down that he's the best to deal with Trump and that he's the best to deal with the economy. And I think you probably want to avoid conversations like healthcare, where, we see the family doctor issue, we see the issue with respect to emergency wait times as well. And I think for the Liberals and the NDP, it's probably the same strategy between the both of them, but it differs, of course, from the strategy that Ford would want to implement. But for the Liberal and the NDP, I think it's going negative, and I think it's going negative on the things that Ford is weak on, and I think that is healthcare and affordability. Probably a little bit more so healthcare than affordability, but I think very much so. Talking about real people that have had to go to an emergency room, that and the statistics around people that have lost their lives or not being able to get the types of services that they need. And so I think that, I don't know if that's going to be successful, but at least they can start to chip at, what Doug Ford's, his extreme popularity. And the other thing the last thing I'll add is, I think what resonates with people is that the idea that Doug Ford cares more about supporting his friends and his with the Greenbelt scandal. And I think that sort of narrative is what you've seen in the debate the other day, with a lot of the other parties attacking about the Greenbelt scandal. And I think if people can tie that to an affordability, and I think if people can tie that to healthcare with the NDP and the Liberals, they'll find some success there.
Yeah, I love those insights, Kyle. When the PCs were looking at calling this election, I was told by a contact of mine that their internal party polling had them at above 50%. And they were like, oh my God, we can pick up 90 to 100 seats. This is going to be amazing. And all we have to do is basically wage an election against Trump and Trump's tariffs. But they ended up getting off to a bit of a bumpy start because the tariffs were delayed by 30 days. And so the narrative that they wanted to spin around economic resilience had to be tweaked a little bit. They had to pivot, like, basically right out the gate. I still think that narrative is a strong one, but I think that there are some things that they need to, like, really enhance what they're doing. I think no matter what, they're going to end up with another majority, but that's just me. But some of the things that I think they should really be thinking about, Kyle, in relation to one of the things that you mentioned about the Liberals and NDP going negative against the PCs on healthcare and affordability, I think they need to start thinking about how they can weave in some additional elements into their platform as they go around, like, what they're going to do to improve the healthcare situation in the province. And as it relates to affordability in particular, like, what they're going to do to improve the housing situation in Ontario as well. I think, like, they've been doing a pretty good job from the perspective of trying to spend as little money as possible to solve big problems, but they have to start changing their tact with that. For the Liberals, I think it's near impossible for them to win this election, but I think a win for the Liberal Party of Ontario is becoming official opposition at this point. And I think that they've done a really good job of developing a narrative where they've shown that they have either issue ownership or some degree of issue ownership over the key issues that voters are thinking about, which are, again, healthcare and affordability. And I think they need to stay the course on that. As it relates to the NDP, I think at this point they've kind of eaten their own lunch. There's not a lot of time left in the election period where they can start to differentiate themselves at this point, but they're going to have to try to find a way to claw back some support from the Liberals. But I think, I'll pass it over to Maggie at this point without saying anything else.
Thank you. And I think I'm officially back on this call. Yeah, I think these are all really good points. The one thing that really struck me in the debate the other day was, one, Doug Ford's focus on, the economy needs to be strong to be able to do all these other things. The parties are talking about, we need to invest in education, we need to invest in healthcare. And his premise is that, like, we can't do these things if Ontario's economy isn't strong. people can decide whether or not they believe that or not. But that is the premise of what they're framing this around. But I think that the challenge with the other two parties is not so much what they're talking about. I think Ontarians care about healthcare, they care about education, they care about housing, but I think it's a trust issue. Like, it's the enemy in Doug Ford versus like they don't know what the other party leaders are about, what they'll do. Even though Marit Stiles has had a long time to build that trust as a leader in this province, I still think that there's that hesitation from Ontarians, both for Marit Stiles and for Bonnie Crombie, about if they trust them or not to lead things. I think there's also the perception that the Conservatives will save Ontarians more money. I think there's a lot to be said about that in terms of the way that we've seen like the $200 checks and other things that I think there's a lot of discussion in the debate around the spa in Toronto. But for some reason, I think Ontarians still see the Conservatives as more fiscally responsible. And I think that the best thing the Liberals and the NDP can do can prove that they are the fiscally responsible leaders that Ontarians can trust to solve the issues that they care about. But I'm not sure that we're there yet.
Yeah, what I've read about, because people question, they're saying, okay, healthcare, all these different pieces that we're not, say, in a better position, or people are concerned about why does Doug Ford continue to ride, fairly high with popularity in his party. They talked about, Maggie, that kind of toughness as well. People right now are at times, there's a lot of fear. And so who's going to stand up, and who is the toughest one, and who will, and like or hate, Premier Ford takes a stand, and whether it's people think it's right or wrong on different issues. He also will quite often do something many politicians don't, is will say when he's messed up in one way or another, he'll say, yeah, messed up, moving on. And we're not used to that, right? That is generally not something. So it's read is that kind of toughness that you don't get, say, from the other leaders. And that's what we're kind of looking at now. I do want to ask you too, when we talk about tariffs, it looks like tariffs are going to happen, and the unpredictability of what's happening in the U.S. Under President Donald Trump. And that has been what Doug Ford has been focused on for this. But in relation to our sector, in a sense, I think anytime you have something that crushes the economy, we know that while it affects everyone, things like COVID or tariffs, or it affects our most vulnerable even more so. What could the parties do when they're talking about tariffs and how to respond to tariffs? Yes, we have to respond with strength in doing that, but knowing it's going to hurt our economy. What are some things you think that government could do overall to make sure that homeless and housing sector that is hurting already? We've seen the numbers from AMO recently with 81,000 experiencing homelessness now. If drastic measures aren't taken, that could climb to 300,000 over the next 10 years. What are some measures they could take to really support our most vulnerable when the tariffs are to come? And just your thoughts, Maggie. We're going to start with you this time, and we're going to shake it in with Kyle. And this was, listen, folks, for people listening, I'm going off script here, so you have to give everyone just a couple minutes to gather their thoughts. Couple seconds.
Well, luckily for you, I'm thinking about this a lot right now. I think there's a few key pieces that I'm thinking about in terms of the response. So the first thing is the people element of it. So I think a lot of the conversation around tariffs is around how do industries respond and how do we respond with supply chains and things like that. But the people impact, the reality is people will lose their jobs. I'm thinking about specific areas in Ontario, like Hamilton, like Windsor, with auto and steel production, where they'll be hardest hit. And in some of those areas, there's already a disproportionately high number of low-income households. And so what will that look like for low-income households who lose their job? And what are the measures that governments can put in place right now to ensure that people don't lose their housing? Like, that is the number one thing they can do in the immediate term. The other thing I'm thinking about is people on fixed incomes that are already incredibly low in Ontario. Tariffs will put pressures on cost of living, affordability, groceries, people who are already barely scraping by, already using food banks, already just paying what they can to pay their rent. Like, they will be on fixed incomes that won't change unless there is direct policy around that. So I think the promises from the NDP and the Liberals on doubling the rates of ODSP, I would love to see the Conservatives put something forward that addresses the really low rates of fixed income supports in our province, especially at a tariff time. And then the last thing I'm thinking about is how do we keep the housing sector building during this time? I think over the past 3 decades, we saw what the stagnation in housing development got us. We are in this circumstance where there's not enough affordable housing. And if we pause in this moment and we don't deliver the housing that we need, and we take this moment to step back and say, we need to take a pause instead of actually using this moment to build more, it will prolong the impacts of the housing and homelessness crises. So I think there's an interesting opportunity here to build the housing that we need. But first and foremost, I think whatever government gets elected in this province, their first priority needs to be protecting people against the impacts of the tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Maggie, I really like those points a lot. I think it's important that we ensure that there are support programs, kind of akin to what we saw at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, just to make sure that people can afford to live. But in addition to that, I think what we're going to end up seeing with the tariffs is they are going to put us into a recession. And the tried and true method that we've had in responding to recessions in this country is investing in infrastructure and investing in the workforce to build the infrastructure. I think in relation to that, what we also need to bring up again is that housing is infrastructure. And the reason why different governments across the country, including this current government, the Ford government, the reason why they haven't outwardly taken that stance that housing is infrastructure is because it sets an expensive precedent that they need to continue to invest in housing. But I think now would be the time to start looking at that as an option, because we have extreme housing shortfalls of all types, right? I don't think that would be a surprise to any of us here or anybody that listens to this podcast. We need to continue to build. I think in relation to that as well, I can't remember if it was Ontario's budget 2020, I think it was budget 2023, where they started to invest in the Ontario Infrastructure Bank, which is supposed to provide low-cost loans at around 2% interest for major infrastructure projects, and potentially also for non-market housing, so that we can keep those costs low. That really needs to be made available so that we can start building the homes and infrastructure that we need to keep our economy as resilient as possible. And in addition to that, I also think that we need to be investing more in innovation as it relates to housing too. Specifically, what I'm thinking about is the way that we go about constructing housing. I know that the Ford government has a keen interest in different forms of modular, and that they want to create different pilot projects to help scale up different modular housing technologies. So I think now is the time to pull the trigger on that and start getting more innovative construction methods scaled up and ready to go.
Yeah, I completely agree with both Maggie and Jacob on the points that you folks made. I think, at the crux of it, we're going to see, as you mentioned, Jacob, a recession. And Maggie, as you mentioned, we're going to see, increasing impacts as it relates to unemployment and the cost of goods like groceries. And so I think at a high level, before getting into the housing component, I think there needs to be one, economic stimulus, because in times of recession, that's typically what we do to help boost the economy. And two, I think we need to diversify our trade, and that means both internally and externally. And I think when we talk about internal trade, we talk about those very burdensome internal trade barriers. As you know, many provinces and territories have different regulations when it comes to inspections, and makes it very difficult for interprovincial trade. So I think those will help lessen the impact, but at the end of the day, especially as it relates to housing, people are still going to feel the impact. And I think the housing supply gap, we're supposed to be building 500,000 units a year or 600,000 units a year, and we're well behind those in terms of starts and completions, and so we can't let that I think be impacted by an upcoming recession. So we need to do things to reduce the cost of housing. I think I talked about it earlier, and many of you we've talked about it as well, with respect to development charges, with respect to the tax on homes. And then I think when it comes to affordable housing and the most vulnerable, I think we need to think about rent supplements. And I feel like to the credit of the Ford government, they did increase on the Canada-Ontario housing benefit, but I don't think it's enough, especially if we're going to be facing unemployment, especially if we're going to be facing increased costs of groceries and other goods. I feel like we need to expand the breadth to which these rent supplements impact, especially in a recession, because it's going to go from just the most vulnerable currently, but that what we define as the most vulnerable is actually going to expand as more people get into unemployment. And I think you're going to see a lot more people, unfortunately, experience homelessness, and so we need to expand the wraparound supports immediately for that, and getting people into stable housing. So I think we need to be prepared for that blunt sort of negative impact of the recession and unemployment and increasing cost of goods.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is too that if or when this has happened, so kind of a stimulus package would we put together to address all the different things you talked about. Maggie, I'm really happy too. Many of you I think all three of you brought up the whole income piece too, right? It's about affordability. And I believe Steve Pomeroy, who's been a guest on this podcast, he's talked a lot about that. Yes, it's housing, but also affordability. If we actually had the incomes where we could afford the market housing that was out there, we'd be having a different conversation, right? As we move this forward. And I think you look at OW is around 1995 rates, right, where they cut it back 20%, never recovered. I saw a chart where say that like in the 90s, you actually could afford a one-bedroom apartment on OW, where it was at. That was kind of the barometer to, if you could do that, right, we could get you basic housing. And now we know that is, probably a third of what's needed to get you that housing. So we have to have the income conversations as well. But Jake, you brought it up earlier too. I mean, at the end of the day, Kyle, you've worked in government, Maggie, through your work, and Jake, like there's an infinite amount of money, right? It's hard to do everything for everyone. It's how do you kind of make that work too, right? So let's talk about hopes coming out, regardless of the outcome of this election. What are your hopes next Friday morning well, probably Thursday night, but let's say Friday morning with a definite, we know what's happening going forward. What are your hopes for the next few years with a new provincial government in Ontario? And you know what, I'm going to say, Maggie, we're going to start with you this time. Go to Kyle and Jake. You have the final word.
Thank you. I remember the last election in Ontario, and I was actually the passenger in a car when the election results were finalized, and I was sad for the province because I knew what had happened a few years before, but I was still hopeful for what could be possible based on the conversation around the election, and I still feel that way too. Like I like living in Ontario. I choose Ontario to be my home, but I do wish better for this province. I'm thinking particularly about things like education. My sister is a kindergarten teacher in Toronto, and there's a lot of students in her class. And I think that kids like that deserve better in Ontario. I'm thinking about healthcare as well. And then I'm thinking about housing and homelessness. I think right before the election, we saw the Ford government say, we're not going to move this legislation on encampments, mostly because I think it gets dropped in an election. But my hope post-election is that doesn't get picked up. Like I want to see them move in a different direction on that as the number one thing. I would like them to see. I would like to see a more housing-focused approach and response to encampments, and I hope that all the other parties do a little bit more work over the next week to hold them accountable to that. So if they are elected again, that's something that's not palatable, something that won't get them any more support, and that they are forced to take a housing-focused approach to solving our problem, because we can't criminalize our way to homelessness, and so I hope that be the case. Going to the next few years, no matter who wins.
Yeah, I agree with that, Megan. And I think and I know you said irregardless of the electoral results, but I think regardless who wins, I feel like what I'm really hoping for is there is a more robust opposition. And I think what we've seen in the last, couple of years with, the majority and now a potential supermajority for Doug Ford, I think we've seen the opposition only have, 10, 11, 12 seats. And I think that in order to have a robust and diverse conversation about the different types of solutions for housing, I think it's important for it to have a more robust opposition. So that's the first thing. I think as it relates to housing, I'd like, if it is whoever it is in there, I would like to see a lot more ambition as it relates to reducing, barriers. I think, we've seen a lot of talk about the red tape, but at the end of the day, the province has the ability to reduce the red tape more than anybody. When we talk about the ability to introduce legislation to require municipalities to legalize how more density and around transit and reduce parking minimums, for example, like it's the province has the most power to do that at the end of the day. Even in most cases, a lot more than municipalities, and when municipalities are unwilling to do it because they have the ability to legislate that. And I think in addition to that, on the general supply piece, I agree with, Jacob, your point earlier that to me, the long-term solution to housing is innovation. And if we're going to build a lot more homes and build them a lot faster, we need to invest into prefab housing. We need to invest into modular housing. And right now, you hear from folks that talk about the upfront costs and the uncertainty of demand, and that's why it's stagnant with respect to the expansion of that sector. I think you need government to step in there and we've seen it with EV vehicles and, the plants in Windsor. So it's not like we haven't done it before and we haven't innovated and come together on that front. And I think we could do it. I think we just need to do it in a more concentrated effort with support from the government. And of course, the reducing cost component, and I think is very important. And an affordable housing, I think I really liked Manitoba's plan. I think they had a very clear plan to acquire and get new housing units for those that are living in unsheltered homelessness and encampments. They have a plan to provide wraparound supports. They had some plans to have social workers come into those encampments, find the right wraparound supports, and get those folks into homes, and on a very clear timeline. And if whatever government comes in, I actually think they should replicate that. I think it's a very clear path forward with a housing first and a compassionate approach to housing, and to stop as Maggie mentioned, the approach that would criminalize people in encampments.
Mm-hmm. No, I love everything that both of you have said. I have a couple hopes and dreams. The first is in relation to healthcare. For one, I've been living in Ottawa for I think 7 years now, and I still don't have a family doctor. Right? We need a full overhaul of the healthcare system in this province. But also when we think about the more vulnerable members, or not members, but people within the province, I think we also need to integrate housing into the healthcare conversation. We just don't have enough supportive housing, just like other types of housing. And I think in order to get resources to create that type of housing, we need to have that as part of the healthcare discussion. I think generally as well, I want to see a lot more ambition on creating housing of all types, whether that's through regulatory change or government investment in creating different types of housing. Like with the cost of living crisis becoming more and more of an issue, impacting more people are going to need affordable housing. Right? So either we build more affordable homes, or we find a way to drive down the cost of homes in the market, whether they're for purchase or for rent. Right? I think the latter is less likely. So we need to build more affordable housing. The related to what you mentioned, Kyle, like I want to see a ton of innovation happen. Like we need to innovate significantly. I want to see all sorts of new modular or novel modular housing technologies, 3D printed construction, mass timber. I want to see all of that become the norm within the next few years. And I know that requires upfront investment. I also know that the Ford government looked at creating an impact investment program for helping scale up these companies. And they just didn't do it because they didn't want to spend money on it. So it's time to go bold. It's time to invest in these solutions. And the other element of what I'm hoping for is just more coordination. Like it drives me nuts. We are such an uncoordinated country, right? Like our provinces and territories aren't that great at coordinating with one another. The federal government is not as good at coordinating with provinces and territories on things for different reasons, but we need to see that change. And because right now I believe I think he's still the chair of the Council of the Federation, Doug Ford, which is basically the forum for Canada's premiers to get together and coordinate on things. I want to see him take a bolder approach in pushing the other provinces and territories to coordinate on different policy outcomes. And that includes like really focusing on housing in different capacities. So anyway, I will leave it there before I continue to rant.
Well, thank you all. This has been a fantastic discussion, and it's full of information, hopefully for our listenership to listen to and just kind of wrap their heads around what's coming forward on election day. I mean, I think the number one thing for everyone who wants to make change happen, get out and vote. Voter turnout has been notoriously low. This is a quick election. Hopefully that's not the case, but we only get our voice heard really in we're only able to affect that choice every 4 years or so, or sometimes less or more. But make your voice heard. So if people want to find out more about the work that you're doing, get in touch with you, speak more, where can they go? Maggie, we'll start with you, go to Jake, and then end with Kyle.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for convening this conversation today. I think it's very timely, and I'm excited that we were able to connect. If you're looking to find out more about my work, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness on all social media platforms. And then I am on LinkedIn if you want to connect and just chat more about our work. Just my name on LinkedIn, you can find me that way.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would love to connect with everybody as well. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope we get to do this all again with this group at some point. People can reach myself and my team at homewardpa.ca. You can also find me on LinkedIn. My name is right there on the screen. It's Jacob Gorenkoff, and I hope to connect with everybody soon.
For me, I recently left the federal government, so there's no professional page or website you can find me at currently, but you can find me on LinkedIn under Kyle Fox. So,
and I'm excited, Kyle, for the sector, having someone as talented as yourself right now. Excited to see what you do next. And I encourage people to reach out to all three of these folks. Brilliant and supportive. And Maggie with CAH, I mean, a lot of the campaigns that you've run that have swayed people, that have brought, and I like to think the sector really did, and in a federal election, brought housing to the forefront, right? To that number one issue. It wasn't always there. Now very much is. And Jake, you mentioned, let's do it again. Yeah, listen, these are crazy times, and we're going to be talking probably about a spring federal election with housing top of mind. So would love to have you all back. In the meantime, I so appreciate you are very, very busy people, and you taking the time to share your insight on this upcoming Ontario election. Thank you so much, and hope to see you again on the way home.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.